First of all, thank you for doing this for me.
You're welcome.
Crazy. Uh, when the idea came to me, I was running and remembered meeting your mom, and I thought you would be the perfect person to talk to be the interview for this chapter. So I read a little bit about your background. I understand you're a computer scientist. You went to Carnegie Mellon. How did you end up getting your job at Adobe, and how did your career evolve there?
Um, During college, I wrote a lot of plugins for Photoshop. It came out while I was in college, and there was a plugin developer's kit available in America online. Uh, Probably have to explain that existed before the web. So um, when I left college, I'd been studying physics, and basically nobody was hiring in physics. So I looked at graphics programming. I ended up with a company that developed a Photoshop accelerator card.
Hmm.
And I did a lot of work there, and I worked with the Photoshop team quite a bit for about a year and a half. And then that company got into some trouble, changed management, changed directions, and downsized. And when I contacted Adobe, they said, "How soon can you be here?"
Wow.
Um, yeah, they were disappointed it would actually take me weeks to pack up my house or apartment at that time and move down there and unpack everything. But so to start out, I was doing performance work, try to make sure that everything runs fast, it runs decently. They changed compilers and some things weren't running fast, other things were okay. They had new code from Intel that had a lot of bugs and a lot of problems. Um, so the first couple of years I was at Adobe, it was mostly focused on that performance part
Hmm.
of find the problems, figure out ways to make them faster, um, fix bugs in things that were supposed to be fast or optimized code, other bits. And then as time went on, I started writing more features or adding options to things and doing more and more all over the program.
Hmm.
Um, so I a lot of the stuff like MMX, SSE, AltiVec, the vectorized instructions, as each new processor type came out, I had to deal with that and adapt the program to make it as fast as possible on each.
Do you, you kind of, I think I know the answer to this question. What you had some background with photography, or why did Photoshop appeal to you? Why were you writing plugins in the first place?
Um, I had some background in photography, worked for the yearbook, sometimes for the newspaper and other bits in college, and also a little bit of art background. And so the idea of Photoshop appealed to me of not only painting stuff, but taking images in, manipulating them. And a lot of the plugins I wrote were like taking images off a supercomputer, bringing it onto a desktop system, converting it into something the desktop could use, or something from like the confocal microscopy lab images that were proprietary
Right.
formats and other bits. Um, so yeah, that appealed. The the a little bit of printing background, a little bit of color background, it all just sort of came together.
Hmm. I'm sure people couldn't even relate to proprietary image formats and turning it into something that the computer could use. I mean, that's just, it's,
Well, yeah, now we've got many standardized formats, and at that time there weren't. Everybody rolled their own. There were standards that were impossible to interpret and nobody actually followed,
hmm.
and lots of other things. And it was interesting.
Uh-huh. So what year did you join Adobe?
I joined the Photoshop team in 1996.
So what was it like then? I remember, but
Well, at that time, Photoshop was more of a professional's tool. A photographer or a retoucher, a pre-press professional. At at that point, you had service bureaus that would take your physical photos and scan them and prepare them for print, provide you with soft proofs that matched the printing material and other things. It wasn't an everyday person's thing. There was no easy way to get photos into digital form at that time. It was an expensive process. The desktop printers at that time were horrible and expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Digital cameras existed if you had $100,000 or so to spend.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I remember just before joining Adobe, while working on the accelerator card, the Associated Press had finally sent some digital cameras to the Olympics, but only a few. And they were able to have such fast turnaround with them that they decided that it would be a good experiment to continue.
Mm-hmm.
These days, you don't think anything about it, but back then, the cameras were expensive, slow, and kind of crappy.
Yeah. That's
Um,
crazy, and it just wasn't that long ago,
yeah,
really.
and then digital cameras became cheaper and better. Scanners became cheaper and better. Printers became cheaper and better. And the World Wide Web took off and made it more accessible for people to share their images and designs and things. Um, so yeah, it was an interesting time to start with this and watch it grow and eventually snowball into this popular culture thing. And I had somebody the other day ask, Photoshop, you mean what people do to their photos? It's like, no, the program, the software.
Right. Yep, it's become a verb.
Yeah, despite Adobe's attempts to stop that.
Really? Why do they
Yeah,
care?
copyright reasons.
Oh.
Same as Xerox lost their copyright, Kleenex lost their copyright.
Oh.
Um, if you don't vigorously fight to preserve the copyright, you lose the copyright
Huh.
or
So,
trademark or whatever. I
mm-hmm.
never fully clear on all that.
Did I think you sort of answered this question, but what are some of the external factors that influence the evolution of Photoshop? And I think you sort of already addressed that. I
Yeah,
mean,
the input getting cheaper and better
mm-hmm.
greatly helped. These days very few people still have flatbed scanners, but used to be you would actually get your photos developed at the drugstore, put the printed photo on the scanner, scan it in. Nowadays you just take a picture with your phone or digital camera. Um, but I still work with a lot of traditional artists who have paper that they need to scan in,
Mm-hmm.
and the camera is not always the best tool for that.
Right.
And then again, the printer is evolving, and they've come quite a long ways. Um, from early on, there were desktop inkjets that were $1,000 and couldn't do even remotely accurate color.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for $150, you get a decent inkjet that will spit out photographic quality prints.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and or you had the very high end where it required a dedicated operator, the ink cost a ton, it wasted a lot of ink, and it took hours to make prints.
Uh-huh.
The Iris inkjets
Right.
back in the day. And now even, if I want a wide format printer, $3,000 and some space to put it, I got it.
Right.
Um,
What were some of the well, before we leave that topic, what about when the web came around? And were you feeling pressure to adapt Photoshop as a tool for web developers?
yeah, we started with a side program that was designed for web imaging, And then people decided that wasn't going to be enough. We needed to have more of it in Photoshop.
Do you mean image
And,
ready?
yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so as the web became more popular, we got more and more pressure to put the features into Photoshop, not just have it as a separate program. Um, and so we started working with the Image Ready team to merge a lot of ideas. Photoshop had convert to indexed color, but it wasn't as advanced as some of the ideas in Image Ready. But we had some ideas that were more advanced than what was in Image Ready, so we had to merge a lot of pieces and concepts. And then part of that went into the Save for Web plugin.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of Image Ready code after we merged the best of everything. Some of it went directly into Photoshop as we made it a little easier to edit. We improved the quality of the conversions. We improved the quality of the plugins, writing web format images and reading the web format images. And then we added a few web-specific features to Photoshop, some of which were liked and some of which were kind of technologically dead ends.
Uh-huh.
But we didn't know where things would go at that point.
What do you mean by a technological dead end?
Slices.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody does that anymore.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Um,
You still have a slice tool, though.
yeah, it's still there, and it still has some uses, and some people do use it. But it was a big thing for web designers at one time
Mm-hmm.
that was superseded by a lot better stuff afterward and left in the dust.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that being able to, the web font revolution, where you didn't have to put everything as an image if you wanted a specific look to some text, that changed
Partly,
things.
yeah. And, well, CSS
Mm-hmm.
changed things a lot. The evolution of HTML
Mm-hmm.
changed things a lot. But we had no way of knowing. We were looking at this and going, okay, it's growing rapidly. We have high school students who want to use the software. How do we design for this? How do we plan ahead?
Right.
And some of it we got right, some of it not so much. Some of it we had to iterate on for several releases to make it more useful.
Uh-huh.
Some of it we had to adjust. Okay, new technologies come along. Do we adopt it or not? And there have been a lot of new technologies that came along. The new Uber file format that everybody will love. No, not really.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, remember JPEG 2000?
No. I mean, I don't, it sounds vaguely familiar, but I don't
Yeah,
really know
it
what
was supposed to replace JPEG. It was supposed to be super great. And it had some good ideas, but it didn't go very far.
Uh-huh. What were some of the big performance challenges that you had? I mean, I remember that everyone used to say that Photoshop ran so much better on a Mac than a PC, and I don't know how much truth there was to that. Um, was that
There,
something for you?
yeah, there was some truth to it. Partly, Apple was shipping on their bigger desktop systems. Apple was shipping fairly optimized hardware.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there were times Apple shipped things that weren't that great, but on the Windows world, you had a mix. Some were good, some were bad. Some they cut corners to keep the cost down, and they made it slower. I mean, it may look the same. It takes four memory SIMs,
Uh-huh.
but are they arranged as one channel and four slots, or is it four separate channels that can run in parallel?
Uh-huh.
And how much cache did they put for level 2 or level 3 in the old days before it was all on chip? How well optimized was it? So code wise, the the compilers on the Mac were a little bit ahead of the Windows compilers.
Mm-hmm.
So we spent a bit of time trying to keep the Windows code fast. And before Apple moved to Intel, we had the AltiVec for PowerPC versus MMX SSE for Windows, and trying to keep all of that code going as fast as possible. And stuff like the Pentium 4 came out. And they made some questionable architectural choices in that chip. And we had to try to figure out ways to work around it.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wish they'd talked to us before they committed to it, but they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
They did talk to us quite a lot after that because they didn't want to repeat that mistake. So yeah, we put a lot of effort into keeping it fast for everybody, but there were limits, and there were things beyond our control. The Mac, you're targeting a few models. Windows, you're targeting
Right.
hundreds of different motherboards and configurations. Who knows? And it could be just one driver on your system slows everything down.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to predict.
Right.
But we did try. We tried to keep the code as much at parity as possible. 99% or so of the code base is shared between the platforms.
Uh-huh.
And then there's that layer that interfaces with the OS. And at first, Windows was sort of an emulation of an old Mac OS version, and then over time that was removed, and the difference became smaller and smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Until it was just a thin edge that dealt with the OS.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably a little bit of that ancient code in there, but not in too many places that it's causing harm anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We were constantly refactoring, trying to clean it up. As we'd hit a bug on one platform and not the other, we'd complain and then go fix the code and try to reduce it.
What was that one of the biggest challenges in the whole Photoshop development in your time with developing and working on Photoshop, or?
Long-term challenges, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's always, Windows changes something in their APIs and we have to adapt to that. Apple changes something in their APIs, we have to adapt to that. Sometimes there are major changes and we have to take the whole team to adapt to the changes in the APIs, like Mac OS X.
Mm-hmm.
That was a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
And there were other things like, some engineers pay attention to crash reports. Some engineers try to ignore the crash reports and just keep writing new code.
Mm-hmm.
They don't like to fix bugs. They like to write new things.
Uh-huh.
It feels good to make something new. It doesn't feel as good to fix something old.
Uh-huh.
And keeping people up to keep up with their reports and their bugs and stuff was interesting.
What was the most epic bug that ever came out after a release?
I don't know. We had lots of great screw ups, and lots of I thought it was supposed to work that way kind of things.
Uh-huh.
I mean, there were lots of crashing bugs that we should have caught before we shipped and just missed somehow.
Mm-hmm.
There were a number of odd, okay, it works in this case, but if I move it just a little bit to the right, everything goes crazy kinds of bugs.
Uh-huh.
They always happen.
Yeah.
And again, we had extensive beta testing, extensive internal testing, and still things would get missed.
Mm-hmm.
And the standard joke in computer science is, you fix a bug, you probably introduced a new bug somewhere. It happens.
Right.
But then we would try to jump on these, listen to the customer reports, read the crash reports, and get on the biggest stuff as quickly as possible.
Right. You kind of mentioned this with the slices. I don't know if I would call it a flop, but it was just it's a feature that you worked a lot on that didn't, eventually kind of fell out of favor due to evolution of HTML and CSS. But were there any features that you guys thought were going to be awesome and they just were not?
There are some features where some people understand it and a lot of people shake their head.
Uh-huh.
The canonical one on that is the channel mixer.
Oh, yeah, I don't mess
If
with that.
you if you think like mixing, adjusting the values in a dark room, or if you think like adjusting, changing values in a matrix, it's obvious how it works.
Uh-huh.
But to a lot of other people, it's totally not obvious.
Uh-huh.
Um, and originally, I wrote that for the pros, the guys who were writing the books, teaching the classes in the dark room, doing serious work, and they got it.
Mm-hmm.
But then I start reading the books and the other tutorials, and a lot of people just did not get it.
Okay, what about
And
the art history brush? Did you make that one up?
no, that one is not me.
That that is a crazy
That
tool.
one, yeah, it's useful for certain effects
Uh-huh.
if you're trying to stylize an image,
Uh-huh.
but it's not good for retouching. It's not good for painting from scratch, basic illustration. So yeah, it doesn't get used that much anymore.
Yeah, it's fun
Um,
to try to explain it to students what it does. Like it paints a state of history, but in a really crazy way.
yeah, that is about as close as you can get.
Oh, good.
It yeah, again, it's somewhat like some of the auto painting stuff in Painter,
Mm-hmm.
that it's taking the previous image and using that as a guide for strokes, but it doesn't seem as controllable. It seems random to people, and they can't control it, so they go on to other things.
What
So
other?
yeah, that one was a bit of a flop, and you know, okay, it's a flop, but it's still there, and some people still use it.
Mm-hmm.
So when I go to 16-bit painting, I have to support it.
Mm-hmm.
When I go to 32-bit painting, I have to make some choice. Do I support it or do I just disable it?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, all of that stuff, even though you think nobody is using it, somebody is.
Mm-hmm.
A great example of that was we took the shortcut off of the brightness and contrast command.
Uh-huh.
It had been assigned randomly, and all the teachers said, "Don't use this command. It's horrible. It's destructive." So we took the shortcut away and reassigned it to something else that made a little more sense. And the entire comic book industry complained. They had workflows built around the brightness and contrast command. They would paint something in a solid color, make a selection within that, hit brightness and contrast, make it a little lighter or darker, make a selection in that, make it lighter or darker, and achieve a gradient effect
Uh-huh.
in a few steps and fairly quickly. Without that shortcut key, their work got a whole lot slower.
Oh, wow.
Fortunately, we'd already been thinking about how to make keyboard shortcuts customizable. And so we sped that up a little bit and made it so that we could customize the shortcuts and they could assign one as needed.
Right.
But up until that point, we also didn't know people were using Photoshop for comic books.
Uh-huh.
So we had to go learn their workflows
Uh-huh.
and what we'd messed up and what we might be likely to mess up in the future and what they needed, etc., very quickly.
Were there any other weird industries that are using Photoshop that took you guys by surprise?
Lots.
Uh-huh.
Defense industry. Um, Before they go try to sell weapons to Congress, well, laser weapons, they have a picture of a plane and a picture of a tank bursting into flames, but the laser is infrared. There's nothing visible.
So you have to paint it in?
So they paint in a red line to show to the congressman, because otherwise the congressmen don't understand it.
That's so funny.
The complex weaving industry, people using jacquard looms and
Hmm.
such, to literally weave images into fabric.
Oh, cool.
Use Photoshop and some rather odd steps to prepare their image for the loom, because you can't just have any random mix of things. You've got to occasionally have an overlap of the threads for the fabric to remain solid.
Right. Uh-huh.
So they have a process of preparing the images for the loom and different mixtures of different thread colors to keep it solid as they weave.
Uh-huh. Wow, that's
And
crazy.
so, yeah, I had to talk to some people and read through these presentations and learn how they did this.
Uh-huh.
Um, and you know, things that seem obvious in hindsight, 3D movies,
Mm-hmm.
um, say Pixar movies, they have to paint the texture map that goes on all these models. It's not done in 3D software, they paint in 2D.
Uh-huh.
But then they have to work with the 3D software in a workflow. So then it's, okay, paint in Photoshop. The Photoshop file goes to this automation process, then renders the picture for them, and they paint again. But how could we help them speed up this workflow and this preview process?
Right.
And then, okay, they want to start painting in high dynamic range images before most people have heard about high dynamic range imaging.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to learn what was state of the art, and it was kind of primitive at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and talk to the artists about how they want to work and what would be ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a large gap in understanding between what they currently wanted and what would be ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and try to address all of that, try to prepare, and that's all the 32-bit per channel functionality in Photoshop. And then, they wanted it years before other people did, and so we started trickling out what we could, and then try to do everything in the remaining parts in one big chunk.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's interesting to learn these different industries, these different workflows, these different techniques, and try to make it all work.
Right.
And because there were a lot of little cottage solutions out there, each had different terminology, each had different ways of looking at the problem.
Uh-huh.
And of course, everybody wanted the solution in terms of what they were already using, or their imagined solution to the problem.
Uh-huh.
And frequently the best answer is not people's imagined solution, it's to understand the full problem and then deliver an actual solution, which sometimes ruffles feathers because people don't understand the solution you gave them.
Right.
It solves the problem, it just doesn't solve it the way they thought it would be solved.
Uh-huh. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, from your time at Adobe working in Photoshop, do you have any one highlight moment or break?
I'm not sure. There's a lot of things. There's big features that took a lot of work, and it's super great to see people using it without even thinking about it now.
Like what?
Let's say just big images.
Yeah.
So Photoshop, when it was written for 16-bit image coordinates.
Mm-hmm.
It could not go beyond 30,000 pixels in height or width. And when it was written, that seemed huge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then years later, people started making these scanning back cameras that could do, 120,000 pixels wide or something, and they wanted to do more in Photoshop. Well, it took 6 months or so of hard code and lots of work where my branch of the app didn't even compile most of the time to make that transition and try to get all the math right to deal with just larger coordinates.
Right.
And then I got that working, and we discovered, well, we'd like to go to 2 billion pixels wide.
Oh.
How do you test that? Well, I did a couple of tests, and they kind of took all day.
Uh-huh.
It's like, okay, we can't actually test out to this limit, so we can't certify that it works out to this limit. So scaled back to 300,000 pixels. That could be tested. You could do a few operations in a day at the time when it was new. I mean, we had to chain together several hard disks
Mm-hmm.
to make the storage necessary for that to happen. Much less we only had a few machines with enough RAM to make that happen.
Uh-huh.
So that was a lot of work, a lot of challenge, a lot of late nights, a lot of, oh dear God, have I bitten off more than I can chew moments.
Mm-hmm.
Finally came together, and now nobody even thinks about it.
Yeah.
It just works. They make huge images. Occasionally they want to exceed the 300,000 pixel limit, and the code is there to do it. It's just a matter of being able to test it in a reasonable amount of time.
Right.
I mean, when your image chews up terabytes of disk space quickly,
Uh-huh.
and it takes several hours to, just draw a gradient,
Mm-hmm.
it limits the amount of testing you can do.
Right.
So those artificial limits are going to remain for a while until the rest of the computer, storage grows, storage speeds up, RAM grows and speeds up, etc.
Uh-huh.
It's a practical limit.
Right. Huh. It must be satisfying, to see people be able to use Photoshop in that way, knowing that you
Oh
had
yeah,
done it.
yeah, and to see the comic book industry grow and use more modern techniques and by giving them a little more control, they were able to do more things faster.
Mm-hmm.
So they could keep the same level of quality, but do things faster, or they could actually improve the quality.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them did,
Wow.
and you could see that develop over time. Watching the daily comic strips. When I started on Photoshop, they were almost all hand drawn, hand inked.
Mm-hmm.
They started drawing in Photoshop, or drawing on paper, scanning, and then inking, or doing color in Photoshop. Now they've almost all switched to just drawing and inking and coloring straight in Photoshop. It's an interesting change.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it means a lot of them no longer have original copies of the strips to sell.
Oh yeah.
Or I ran into a well-known airbrush artist
Mm-hmm.
several years ago, and he was no longer using the airbrush at all. He was doing everything in Photoshop, and he said it was so much faster, so much more productive, so much healthier for him. He never wanted to go back.
Huh. Yeah, I can imagine. No fumes in Photoshop.
No fumes, no blowing your nose and getting a multicolor result. No ink staining your hands and
Uh-huh.
such. Yeah.
Oh,
Uh,
that's interesting.
and
Well,
this was a guy I had admired as I was growing up. I saw him in his illustrations in magazines and aspired to do as great as he did. And okay, we just totally passed that industry.
yeah, isn't that an ironic twist?
Somewhat, yeah.
Well, Chris, I'm going to let you go. I've got more than enough information that I need, but this has been really fascinating and perfect.
If you want to talk more, I can.
That's good. No, I just want to make sure I've got what we've talked about recorded. I may have some follow-up questions as I extract pieces from the interview.
Okay.
I really appreciate it. I owe you.
You're welcome.
I'll send you a copy of the book, Chris.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.